Welcome everybody to today's We Can Do Better conversation on loving by example. So we're going to approach this topic from our experiences and connect it back to leadership. And I'm honored to have as my guests today, Rachel Druckenmiller, Lorie Corcuera, and Teresa Quinlan. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. We're recording this on the last day of February, the month of love, Valentine's Day. And no better people to be having this conversation with around loving by example. And so what does that mean, right? Let's invite the conversation on that. What does it mean by loving by example? Personally, we want to always connect it back to leadership. What does that mean? I guess, Lorie, I'll start with you.
Okay. So I actually was asked this question, how did this term loving by example come about? And I think it just was organic in one of the other conversations I had. Might have even been another podcast, and we were used to this concept of leading by example. So it was probably from that, and what would be the difference between leading by example and loving by example. And I feel that they're both similar, and that we have a responsibility to start leading with starting ourselves or leading ourselves. And so the loving by example is about loving ourselves first so that we can love others more completely. So I'm just going to pause there and see what Rachel and Teresa have to add to that.
Maybe just hell yeah. That it absolutely is a combination of, I think sometimes what I can do for me, I can then do and express for other people. But sometimes I do believe that we have a greater capacity to do for others than we can for ourselves. So is it a chicken and egg situation? I don't think one is dependent upon the other. I think there needs to be acknowledgement as to where you might be, and then the work potentially you have to do to balance it out.
And I guess I think of the times where I have felt loved by others, when I felt like others have been loving me by example. And the way that feels is it feels like someone, like I think of when I first started working, I was in my late teens, I was interning. And my manager, every day, she would come over to my desk and just kind of sit up on my desk, and she'd say on the side, like, how you doing? And she authentically meant it. And every day for about 5 to 10 minutes, I was in college, right? My life was very complicated. And I felt like she genuinely cared about me. And for me to have that experience in the workplace so early on of what it meant to create space for those conversations, for that human interaction, instead of her coming right to me and saying, all right, here's a list of things I need you to do today. We really did connect as humans first. And I felt like I mattered to her, even though at the time I really had nothing to bring her, like as a, 19, 20-year-old, I was, just happy to have a job, but she really saw me, and she really made me feel like I mattered from the very beginning. And that honestly has carried with me throughout my career, is that sense of feeling like I matter and feeling like my voice matters. And I think that's one of the kindest things we can do for someone, is to just be present for them and to connect as a human with them first and foremost, and then get to the task list.
So that impact, right?
I'm curious to ask a follow-up question.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lorie.
Oh, sorry. I'm curious. I'd love to ask a follow-up question for Rachel. So when that individual was able to care for you, did you notice how, they were caring for themselves? Was there something that started off from them loving themselves in order to be more present and to make you feel that you mattered? I was just curious if there was something that they were doing within themselves.
I mean, she was clearly somebody who was a pretty reflective person, and somebody who was kind of aware of her own emotions and responses to things. Like, she would even kind of describe those kind of things to me as she was going through them, whether it was personal or professional. And I kind of felt like from the beginning, she was real with me about her life, and not crossing a line in terms of what would be inappropriate, but I really felt like she let me in. And so her willingness to kind of self-disclose, and her willingness to not treat me like an underling, I feel like that was really reflective of her own comfort level with herself. And that I really felt like she wanted to lift me up and to see me succeed. And she was very invested in my success. And she was a really hard worker, and she was committed advocating for herself and to asking for things she needed and vouching for opportunities. And so I saw her doing that for herself, and she did it for me too, you know, so it went both ways.
Love that, Rachel. And so this notion of how you care for yourself shows up in how we be with other people, right? And so then that the modeling that happens and the authenticity of that creates the space for others to feel that, to then take that on and be impacted by it, and then to choose to be that as well, and to pay it forward. And so as we think about leadership from a place of loving by example, and we can talk about love and leadership if that's kind of freak people out about this, let's get used to that, right? We got to get used to talking about love and leadership. So the listeners on that, we talk about this openly in our different communities that we're a part of. And so what does that mean to lead with love?
I think it's really simple. It means to lead with love. Like, this is not rocket science by any stretch of the imagination. Love is a universal understanding. We all know what that word means. What it looks like and how we do it is going to be different. And it's supposed to be different, just like leading by example, loving by example. In leadership, I don't lead based on how I lead. I lead based on how the person needs to be led. So I don't love someone based on how I need to be loved. I love based on how they need to have love expressed to them. So some people that I may lead require accolades and words of affirmation, and other people might need quality time from me. And if I don't figure out what their love language is, or how they need to be loved in the workplace, then I will never be able to love by example. I'll just sort of love in maybe a way that I think is necessary, but that I might miss the depths of that connection that Rachel experienced in that moment of, oh, she seems to see me. Well, maybe perhaps your love language is quality time, like to be seen as an individual, where someone else's might be physical touch. I had an employee who, whenever we met, it was a hug first, and then we said hello. And that expression, even in virtual, we would come close to the screen and like hug the screen, like, hi, how are you today? So we initiated because that's what she needed. And as a leader, just like any leadership responsibility, you have to be prepared to be able to give what the person needs. That's leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'd love to just add to that. That just makes me feel so good. And I'm a hugger too. Physical touch and words of affirmation is my love language. So yeah, I take any kind of virtual hugs anytime. But what I really loved about what you said, Teresa, is that to lead with love is to really understand, or take the time to listen to understand who is in front of us, because everyone is different in the way they feel they belong, in the way that they feel that they matter, in the way that they feel that they are loved. And so as a leader or a human being, if we take the time to see them beyond the physical and really get to know who they are, then that's when we really make that human connection. And to add to what Rachel was saying earlier, that vulnerability is such a key, a way of showing the love, because you're saying, hey, I'm human too, and I make mistakes, I'm not perfect, and I'm leading by or loving by example, and it makes you want to be like them. It makes them real and authentic.
I love the connection you just made about vulnerability and being real. And so you all know that vulnerability is a part of my story, and I connected back to humanness, right? It's part of being human, and yet we don't like it. We're uncomfortable, many of us, with vulnerability. We feel that it might be weakness, and it's actually the key to open many doors in terms of loving and leading and connecting with self and others. And so what is it, or those qualities you were talking about, Lorie, in terms of loving and leading? There's sort of like building blocks, like curiosity, right? In terms of ways of being. What are some of those things for you that you've experienced in yourself or in others that helped you build that connection and seeing someone as someone that's loving by example?
for me, like what have I seen in others?
What qualities that
Mhm.
kind of denote to you or indicates to you, hey, this person's loving by example, or maybe it's a feeling. Rachel was talking about it as a feeling. It is a feeling, but what are some of those things that we'd invite leaders to step into as they move maybe from a fear-based mindset outside of that to a love-based mindset in terms of their leadership?
Yeah, well, I created this love first acronym, and L stands for learning more about yourself. So I feel that the leaders or people who are loving by example are taking the time to be self-aware, because it's only through that self-awareness that you feel more grounded in who you are. The O stands for opening yourself to courageous experiences, because I believe that when we're out of our comfort zone or we're trying things that are completely different, that is when the growth happens, right? If you're always on the same path or autopilot, it doesn't seem like anything's new. I mean, obviously everyone again has a spectrum, so do what feels right for you. But if you're, just starting to try different things to learn more and grow more, that's where it happens. And then the V is to share our voice out loud. So I really have, from my own personal experience, the more I shared my story, the more I was acknowledging that happened and that is part of me and I'm okay with it. And when we know the power of storytelling is that when we hear, we can relate. And I feel like if we could just more storytelling, more human first conversations. I mean, this is why it's such a huge connection and movement now, is because it's all about connecting and sharing stories. And then the E is embrace our whole being. So once you've learned more about yourself, fully of everything about yourself. I know it's not easy, it's easier said than done, but little by little, as I get older and learn more about myself, there's that acceptance, that radical acceptance.
Radical acceptance. I really like that.
Mm.
I would like to offer into this space too that one of the things we might challenge is vulnerability equals weakness, or that is a common way to look at it, and maybe present the opportunity of looking as vulnerability is maybe the equivalent of transparency. And so what gets in your way of just being transparent are all of those limiting beliefs around, oh, people might not like me, people might think I'm a little bit weird, what if someone disagrees with me, what if I can't be included or belonging, and challenging all of those thoughts is, where's the proof that any of that is actually true? And there will be very little opportunity for us to prove those limiting thoughts have any proof to them anyways.
I love that reframe, Teresa, in terms of vulnerability is transparency and willingness to be transparent. How can you be authentic or transparent, right, without going there, right? So what does that bring up, Rachel? What thoughts come to your mind when we talk about, when Teresa helps us look at vulnerability in a different way like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think of a situation I had where I was in a meeting with an organization and with several other, team members there at the time, and we were the COO, the CFO, and then two folks in the HR team. And I was sharing an insight about something that I wanted to make them aware of that a lot of people in our industry wouldn't necessarily share, about kind of something that they should just keep in mind if they were going to go down a particular route, a potentially negative impact of something that could happen. And it can be a little bit of an unpopular opinion. And when I shared this, as I was leaving, the CFO reached out to shake my hand and he said, "Thank you for your transparency." And on the way back to the car, the conversation with a colleague was, we really have to be careful we're on the same page, because there was a fear of saying something that might not be what was the commonly accepted way of doing something, even though the person whose support in the room probably mattered the most, like the person writing the checks, said that he appreciated the transparency behind it. And so I think a lot of times, speaking, Lorie, what you were mentioning with the word like being courageous, I feel a lot of this is that for us to take those steps, like we often know, I think in the moment of what to do, but there's a fear, there's a reservation behind it, because again, to what you were mentioning, Teresa, of this fear of like, if I say this, I'm going to be rejected. If I say this, I'm not going to be in the club anymore. If I disagree, if I do something that disappoints somebody, and so we tell the story of this thing that's going to happen, which may never actually happen. And it holds us back from doing or saying or being or showing up as the thing that is most needed in that situation.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that can happen is we've been having this conversation, started to kind of think about my own experience with love in the workplace, and in a conversation with Kevin Monroe was saying how I believe for a long time, and I know this is a shared experience by many people, that I believed that love and acceptance were on the other side of impressing people and on the other side of achievement.
Mm.
And I think that what can happen is that, you know, we jumble it up a bit, right? That I thought if I just impress people enough, if I know enough, if I'm an expert enough, if I'm good enough, then I will be loved, because that's how school works. You know, you get a gold star and you do a good job, and it's like acceptance. And I think a lot of people in the workplace are really, really like desiring a depth of love that they're not experiencing, a depth of intimacy that they're not experiencing at home, in their other relationships. And so we just literally throw ourselves into work thinking that this really deep desire we have is going to somehow be met by our careers. And it's at the deepest place is going to be met with authentic, genuine, vulnerable, open, courageous, honest human connection.
I don't think we know how. We understand the word unconditional love. I don't think we know how to do that. I do believe that our life experiences have simply taught us how to love conditionally. Whether we have belief patterns that set that up for us, I will be loved when, or we behave in that way. I will love you when. And I don't know how many people love unconditionally outside of my dog. I really don't. I have not experienced a human being who loves unconditionally.
Maybe the Dalai Lama. Maybe, I don't know. I've never met him, but.
Right. Maybe that level of enlightenment. So, I mean, to even mention something like that kind of makes you feel like, oh, that's a tall order to kind of feel. Now I got to get to that. Jesus, I'm trying to get from minute to minute today. Just not self-imploding, right? So this whole, like, it's so important to talk about, because when people are listening, they're just like, fine, let's talk about it. But when I go to work and I am leading and all of this stress and mountain of messy peopleness is coming my way, how am I supposed to unconditionally lead with love first? Like, this is a great question. This is a great conversation, because I just think maybe we could just, take our foot off the gas a minute and say, you're a human being. It's going to be hard. And so most of the time you will get it right. And sometimes you'll get it wrong. But when you get it wrong, you can always course correct. You can always say, man, sorry, I got that wrong. Let me try again. And when your intention is to try again to love unconditionally, people will give you that second chance. For sure, they will give you that second chance. I just don't ever remember a time when my leader came up to me and apologized from their own volition. In my experience, it was because I brought it up and said, what is going on with you? You are not behaving in a way that I'm expecting as my leader. And then they divulged. Yeah, you're right. I haven't been. Okay.
So maybe it's what you're just talking about, the love first, whether we're hoping it's the leader, but maybe it's not always going to be that person, because they're human too, that it's time for all of us, regardless of our position or title or whatever, that we start to love by example and just hopefully create that more, because it becomes way more contagious. And it is a lifelong love journey. It's like leadership or being human. It's life. It's a constant opportunity to keep learning. What was it that
love, learn, and let go?
Love, learn, and let go. You know what? As we got off the phone, I actually created a diagram around this, and I'm going to share it with you, Brian. But I imagine this circle where it's like it's constant. You're loving and you're learning and you're letting go, and you're loving and you're learning and you're letting go, and it's just constant. It's just this journey.
I love that. And I'm going to come back for a second to the connection, I forget which one of you made it, between acceptance and achievement. I think maybe it was Rachel, in terms of impressions and achievement. And why leaders don't step forward and be first in terms of, you know, apologizing or coming back, like Teresa's talking about, and acknowledging something like that. Because what is then the relationship between acceptance and love, right? Are they able to lead from love if they're not able to accept and maybe show some vulnerability or transparency with having done something that impacted their team negatively or something along those lines? And so this notion and connection of transparency and willingness to be vulnerable and transparent about it, but also this connection back to love and acceptance. Hey, is the leader authentically, just like anybody else, going to say, oh, are they going to think less of me if I apologize? Because that may be equated to weakness or less than or not good enough, or I have expectations from others of X. And now this is going to chip away at that. And so am I now reluctant to be transparent because of all those possibilities?
You know, there's a book I read a couple years ago. I burned out 3 years ago, and in the midst of that, did a lot of reflection. And there's a book I read called "In Every One Culture." That was a great book, and there was a story in the book about about a woman who was really high up at her organization, and she was on the leadership team. And this company had a setup where the employees would sort of like elect who was going to be on that team or not. And if basically you weren't up to snuff, you could get like voted off the island essentially. And she was like a really high achiever, really high performer, but she got kicked off the island at one point. And I'm reading this, and it turned out that she was so focused on getting ahead that she was completely negligent about intentionally connecting with people in a meaningful way and really being their advocate. And so it gave her this opportunity to really take a piece of humble pie and to go back to these people that she had essentially left in the dust and have an authentic conversation with them to say, you know what, I realize I did this and I'm sorry I did that she went around and apologized. And I read that and I felt really convicted that I had maybe done something similar. And I walked into the office and I just sort of like, you know, asking this question, like, who do I need to talk to first? And of course, the person who came to my mind first was the last person I wanted to talk to. I was like, but that's the hard one. Can I wait? And I you know, asked her if she had 5 minutes, and I got into the room, and the first thing I said, I want to let you know that I'm sorry. I said, I'm sorry that I have not been easy to work with. I'm sorry that I've not been approachable. I'm sorry that I've not been available. And I didn't use it as an opportunity to defend myself, because I don't think that would have been particularly helpful. But I said, this is what happened. I'm realizing that it might have been rooted in this. And I'm really sorry for how that's affected you, your work, your ability to trust me, and any experience with your clients. And I was mildly terrified to have this conversation. So I'm not going to pretend like I walked in confidently, like, I got this. You know, I was not somebody who was comfortable being vulnerable like that. And I'll never forget the response that she had to me. And her response was that she then opened up. And this is somebody who's like tough, you know what I mean? Like, not somebody who really breaks easily. And she opened up about the fears and insecurities she had, and how she was afraid that people were going to see her as an imposter, and that they were going to realize she didn't really belong at the table, and was just counting down the days to retire before someone figured out that she shouldn't be in that spot. We're both crying by the end of the conversation, and we hugged each other. And it was this moment. It didn't fix it. It's not like we can just go in and be like, I said sorry. You know, it takes time to rebuild trust with somebody. But it was such a powerful example to me of what it looks like when we're willing to show up and to like open up our heart to somebody. I've experienced, and I'd love to hear, you know, everyone else's experience with this, that every time I've done that, people have responded to me with grace and compassion, and have not taken advantage of the fact that I did that.
Because I believe that's an example of that vulnerability and the courage to just be so real. And I think people are like surprised by it, because it doesn't happen all the time. And then all of a sudden they're like, wow, if she could do that, then, you know, then maybe I can open up a little bit more about who I am. And I was talking about that story, what came up for me about achievement is that it's externally focused. It's, you know, when I grew up too, I'm a high achiever. I worked as well and burnt out. But every time, but when I was doing that, it was because I was trying to find something outside of me to fulfill me. And it wasn't until I went through this divorce and hit rock bottom and then was almost forced to look inwards that I realized that that was how I was leading and living my life. And once I started to realize there's actually more to who I am, then that's when I started to love and you know, love by example. I'm still, the thing about that's really coming up for me for Teresa is like, yeah, what is that loving by example? You've really stimulated my mind about that, because there, you know, I don't want to, it is a pressure almost for me to be a certain way, but like, who really is loving unconditionally? I don't even know what that really means too. I just have this dream that maybe one day that is where I'm striving to be more of. Mm-hmm.
Me too, Lorie. I am also striving for that. And it is like anything we strive for in personal growth, it is an intentional focus, minute by minute, day by day, that we unravel how we were in pursuit of how we want to be, in pursuit of that growth, right? Or in striving for that growth, or in evolving into whatever that future state is for us. And it's a navigating path of, well, sometimes I took a right-hand turn and that doesn't quite resonate with me. But maybe that was because I was following someone else's footsteps for a little while. I mean, mentorship is a great way to learn how to do things. And so we watch what other people are doing. We read Dalai Lama's book and we go, well, this is fantastic, I'm going to try this. And it turns out we can't shave our head and live in a robe. And so we have to find a different kind of path. That one didn't really work for us. So we had to find a different path. And then we read someone else's book, or we follow someone else, or we have some conversations. And along this path, we become the alchemist, we assimilate, and we take things that resonate with us to our core. And this is the authenticity of loving by example. And people can feel that. Like when you're in the presence of someone who is loving you because they have self-love, but is loving you freely and unconditionally, you feel it hands down. And for some people who are open to that, it just feels magnificent. For others who are not open to it, what I've heard it feels like is it's just a little uncomfortable for them because they're not in that space yet. So they're kind of like, it's kind of weird that it seems like you really like me. That's kind of weird in the workplace. Like we're in the workplace. Mm-hmm. So we hear that as examples of that's what it feels like when you're just not quite there yet. But it doesn't mean that we don't aim for it or strive for it or want to have workplaces that are like it. Doesn't always, to Brian's point, doesn't always have to be the leader that goes first either, right? So this recognition of, and I believe Lorie, you mentioned the same thing, this recognition of we are part of the workplace. The leader just has a title. Setting them up as the one responsible for everything is kind of a faux pas. They can't be responsible for everything. They're not responsible for love in the workplace. It'd be great if they had it, but we're all responsible to show up in the workplace with that as part of the intention.
And that's the key word, is intention. Maybe loving by example is having that intention to try to choose love in those moments, those little moments, right? So coming back to Brian, because I know he brought this up in our previous conversation, tell us more about the choice. You know, you were mentioning about that is really part of loving first and loving by example.
Yeah, so it's and this is what Teresa was just talking about. It just came up for me again. It's back to that love, learn, and let go kind of thing. It's yes, it's not a linear path. We learn. We may follow a mentor. We may get some guidance from someone. The alchemist in us pulls in the different pieces of it. But the choice is: are you going to be open to newness? Are you going to be open to other ways of looking at things? Are you going to be open to a new perspective? And when you do that, what opens up for you? And part of this is you might fail. Guess what? You might fail. And guess what? That's part of the alchemist thing. Oh, maybe I won't do that next time, or I'll come at it differently. Just try it one more time. Maybe something happened with how I approached it last time that led to the failure. But what if we were open to that? And so there's this openness, right? This open-heartedness, this willingness, this transparency. And as I was writing down different words: transparency, openness, vulnerability, humility, all these words, right, that most people will look at and maybe not look at as strength, right? Because those are kind of people related words. And this word that I absolutely hate, soft skills, right? And qualities that maybe not be valued as strong leadership. And I think what we're talking about is, what if we looked at them that way? What if we looked at, and this point just came up when you were sharing, we look at title, we look at structure of organization, we look at hierarchy. But if we can look at each person in the organization, regardless of where they sit as a human being, does that not give us more space or open up the space for us to connect with them at least more unconditionally, if not completely unconditionally? And so unconditional may be, it's an aspiration, right? It may be like perfection. It's not something we can achieve. But you talk about intention. The phrase that came up for me was intentional commitment to living into the aspiration. And so that's what this feels like. It's the commitment to living into the aspiration. Means I'm going to try every day, be in the choice, as Lorie's talking about, to show up this way. I may succeed sometimes, I may fail. But if I'm intentional about it and I choose this, more often than not, I'm going to show up this way and build that muscle so that it's more of the way I be. And when I do that, I win, others will win because of how I engage with them, and we will create the space to create better together in our relationships and the work we do and those things we engage in. And so that's what's coming up for me, the choices, leading with choice. We've been so conditioned around fear that we've been numb to being open to being conditioned by love or leading with love. And so what if we reconditioned ourselves? How might we do that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think something that comes to mind as you're saying that, with you mentioned the word kind of choice and choose. There's something in like the kind of like the couples and marriage space where people are encouraged to say, like, I choose us, like the relationship is an entity. And so when we think about this in terms of the workplace, it's like when I'm going into it, so often the people, it's like, every man for themselves, right? It's like, how can I get mine? Which I think is a mentality that a lot of people go into the workforce with, right? Of how can I get what I need, versus how can I think about, how can I choose something that would be good for us, something that would be good for the collective. And that idea of choice of how can I show up in love in this moment. And maybe you don't use the word love. I mean, I know that different people have different connections to these words, but maybe for you, the word love is grace. Maybe for you, the word love is care. How can I show care in this moment? How can I show grace in this moment? How can I show forgiveness in this moment? How can I show compassion in this moment? How can I show humility in this? How can I show humility in this moment? Like, I think, again, depending on where people come from, if somebody comes from a situation maybe where there was some type of abuse and like the word love has been just really manipulated, that might be difficult for them. And so if we can give people other vocabulary to use that doesn't necessarily say, use love or else, we're essentially saying the same thing, but perhaps using different words, using different attributes of love. And I think that's something practical that we can offer to people through this conversation is, how can you use a characteristic of love to think about how you want to show up more intentionally in the workplace and outside of work?
Even if we just think of it in the sort of definition of my willingness to be concerned of the general welfare of others, well-being of other people. So if I want you to have a level of happiness, of well-being, of welfare, and I'm concerned about that, so I choose us because I'm also concerned about my own. I should be concerned about my own, and I'm also concerned about yours, and they're not mutually exclusive. They're always together. Then what do? I choose kindness. I choose compassion. I choose empathy. I choose to ask questions to gain a deeper understanding. And when I can't get to an understanding of you because I don't have the capacity, I've never really experienced it, no matter how many questions I ask you about it, I still can't really comprehend it, that we have acceptance without the need for agreement, without that need. And that to me is the essence of what you're talking about, Rachel. That, yes, we can describe that. If we look up love in the dictionary, maybe it says something along those lines of all of those things, is just accepting people just because.
Acceptance without agreement.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I'm just thinking in terms of that. We can accept one another, but just not have the same perspective, share the same perspective. And this we versus me mindset that we might go in there with gets back to the work I do around interdependence, right? Strategic interdependence. How do we, it's the thought that I serve us so we can serve others, right? And so us includes me.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like excluding myself, but it's the intention of it's all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And how might I factor in other people into how I show up, the decisions I make, including their input in that, and that being how I lead. I lead from the place of thinking of others and the whole, us,
Mm-hmm.
and not from independence, me, which may be, the reality is most people show up most often from independence. I serve me.
Oh, I just love that you said that. So I'm glad that you went first before me, because one of the things I wanted to just bring together what the essence of what Rachel and Teresa was talking about, and just building off the we, is that one of the things we teach or guide our leaders through our leadership program is this idea of going into the relationship with your team members as a partnership. And so we give them this tool to use as a way to build that trust, is a trust agreement. You can call it a trust agreement, a partnership agreement, or whatever, you know, if you don't want to use the word agreement, but it's really, the intention is to listen to each other on what's most important to each of us. And it's not so much that you're my leader, but it's more like we're going into this together, and we're going to create what this looks like and what we're going to, you know, build off, and what's that foundation of our relationship. Because at the end of the day, it's all about relationships. So when I bring it back to love in the workplace, or leading with love, or leading with compassion, whatever word we want to use, it's like, are we coming into this together and creating this long-lasting, loving partnership so that we can be the best for each other and create wonderful things from that place?
I started drawing.
Uh-oh.
Because this is what happens when I start thinking, this is what I start thinking about. I start thinking about representations that help people to maybe contextualize stuff that we're ruminating in our heads, because there is me and there is you, and we have stuff that is our own, and we have our own aspirations and our own goals. Because I think sometimes when people start thinking about it, what comes up is like, yeah, but I do have my own goals, and it's not bad for me to have my own goals. Is it? No, it is not bad for you to have your own goals. It's actually really good. And you should aim for those and strive for those, and they're important. And yes, they are the fullness of who you are. And then sometimes we have to come together. But I drew a whole bunch of them because they're different sort of depths at which we need to come together. Sometimes the us part is really whole and the individual is really minimal. And sometimes the individual is really big and the us is really tiny. So there's variations at which these things, I think, really can come together. We don't have to sacrifice one for the other. We just have to kind of know, where does the teeter-totter have to swing in this particular moment? How much of us is us in this whole component? And how much is really just me, or needs to be me?
I love that, Teresa. And what comes up for me as you share that is this whole notion of, there's no one way to do interdependence. It's a spectrum, right? At each situation, it's going to be situational, just like anything else, right? So this whole notion of there's only one way to do anything, this is just another example of there's no way to do, one way to do interdependence. Situationally, because guess what? Human beings are different. So each combination of human beings is going to create another instance of uniqueness. And so how do we honor that, right? We honor that by getting curious about it. Okay, what does Lorie bring to the situation? What does Rachel bring to the situation? What does Brian? What does Teresa? And the openness to it is where the leader can say, I'm coming at this intentionally, back to this unconditional love, aspirational example. That's how I'm coming at it. If leaders do, if we as human beings do, what's the likelihood we're going to get to a better outcome? Right? Versus, you know, and yes, we can fail during that, and we may have to revisit it, adjust based on what happened and whatnot. But the intention there too, as Teresa was pointing us to. And then just thinking about this notion of we're interdependent and interconnected as human beings. Again, this humans first mindset of, there's 10,000 human beings in our organization, not 10,000 employees. And we're not talking about levels, we're just talking about unique instances of human beings. And guess what? Any combination of those, when we work interdependently on teams, brings different contributions. It's not, Lori's an accountant, Rachel's an IT developer, Teresa's a project manager, Brian's this. Okay, that's what we got hired for, right? That's the box we got put in when we got hired. But what are we missing? By not looking at people as human beings, and from a leadership perspective, and even from a hiring perspective. And how does that factor into what we continue to perpetuate because we're not open to seeing differently?
Yeah, I think of like, did you guys ever watch the show Undercover Boss?
Yes.
I think of the examples of, right, like the clerk that nobody notices, right, that the undercover boss person happens to come by, the CEO that's disguised comes by and meets that person, hears their story, and is so deeply touched and has this experience of thinking, so often, especially in executive positions, people are functioning at like a really kind of high and removed level, kind of intentionally, I think, just to like get through the strategy of what has to get done to run the business, so that like people have jobs and so that they can keep, their employees and keep the lights on. And it's when they have this opportunity to actually get like boots on the ground and be with one of their people and hear their story, that they have this experience that might even cause them to change an entire policy of how they're doing something. So I feel like one of the most helpful things a leader could do, and I think leaders, we've alluded to, are at all levels, right? It's more of a mindset of recognizing that everyone has influence and has the potential to lead. But for each of us to really take that time to just get to know somebody as a person and really understand who they are. And I mean, I think of today, I had a conversation with a woman who I'd not met before. And when we sat down to talk, she goes, I'm going to be honest. I didn't like look up the history. I don't have like 3 questions to ask you. I didn't look at like all your LinkedIn stuff. And I was like,
That's awesome.
I was like, I didn't either. And she goes, I just like to get to know the human. Like so I said, you know what? I appreciate that. And that was the first 30 seconds of the conversation. I was like, I know this is going to be an awesome conversation because we both showed up really wanting to know what you can't find out through someone's LinkedIn profile.
Yeah.
And it made all the difference just in that first bit of interaction of her being really present and being curious. And we can sense, I think one of the things, we've been talking around this, is that all of us want to be known. And one of the most difficult things we can experience is when we feel like we're not known. And when someone asks us questions about ourselves and they really care to hear the answer and they ask follow-up questions and they dig deeper and they say, what was that like? And what did that feel like? And gosh, what did you think about that? Like, we just open up and open up and open up, and it creates this inevitable opportunity for connection, because as you start to see somebody kind of blossom like that, I mean, you can't help but connect with them in a deeper way. And I think a lot of times people maybe we avoid that. We're like, I don't have time for that. Like, this thing takes too much time. And it doesn't have to take a lot of time. It can be a 1 or 2 minute conversation. It can be a smile and a how are you and a follow-up question about something you know about their life from a previous conversation. Like, so I think there's just little moments of intentionality are at least a place to start. If someone's like, I'm at Fort Knox, I'm not sharing stuff, just start by asking people questions and just by being interested in them and seeing them. And little by little, they'll likely try to pull those types of things out of you as well.
They might. I think that's the important part to remember. They might not either, because it isn't what they need, not from you. They have it from others. Right? Mm-hmm. My tribe is small, and I don't open up to people outside that tribe. I've got it, and I'm resolved, and I feel loved, and I feel fulfilled. And so these other relationships in my workplace, I don't need to have that. It's not something that I need. And then there's other people who are like, my circle isn't full yet. And so in my workplace, I do need that, and I do want that. And that's where I think it's critical that we acknowledge and honor what other people are needing from us. So when someone says, I'm good, that we acknowledge that truth for them is that, okay, you're good. So I don't have to spend all this time sort of clawing through and like, who are you? Please love me in return. And you're just like, okay,
No.
you have to get your love elsewhere because it isn't coming from me here. So I think that might be an important piece to remember for people who are listening, because that is the element of leadership in my experience. For how I navigated through it was learning that every individual requires something different, and it takes the time. Sometimes you need a PhD in your people to be able to know exactly what those things are. And sometimes you could learn it in 6 months, but more than likely it's year over year of consistent deposits into the trust bank for someone to reveal their whole self to you. Because in truth, we're all coming with our backpacks of stuff. And that paints every new experience we have. So some of us are like an open book, and here you go, here's my whole history. And most of us are more like, here's a little bit, let's see how you handle that. Can I give you a little bit more? Depends on how well you handled it.
Love that, Teresa. And what's coming up for me in my own personal example is when I was managing my IT team, I treated everybody fairly. That was my goal. That was my aspiration, right? To show up that way. But I didn't treat them the same because their needs were different, right? And so this notion of I've got to be fair to everybody means I've got to do the same thing for everybody. That's not fairness. That's consistency maybe, but it's not honoring what the needs are. And that, because actually doing that requires that you ask the questions that we've been talking about, get to know the person deeply, get curious about the person. And then you're fair to everybody in terms of your approach, your energy, and speaking and understanding each person for who they are and what they need, so you can bring that in terms of, just interactions with you, or career-wise, aspirational, so you can give opportunities and look for opportunities like that. But it's actually work to treat people fairly. There's work involved on your part. You've got to take some intention and some energy towards that to get to know the person. Because when you do, it shows up as love and caring and these grace and these words that Rachel was pointing us to in terms of different ways. We can call it different things, compassion. But people start to feel that. And that's, I think, one of the things where, how do you know when there's loving by example? It's you can feel the energy there. It's an energy thing for me in terms of, and it's a consistent energy. It's like, it's not like, oh, I did it Tuesday, I'm good, right? No, it's like, this is how I be in this being versus doing thing. This is how I be. And this is aspirationally how I want to be. It gives you a kind of a compass or a guidepost of checking in with yourself too. It's like, hey, that's my aspiration. That's how I want to be. Oh, I wasn't necessarily living into that as well today for whatever reason. I'm human, right? So there's an element of that's going to be something you're going to experience. So how do you deal with that is part of it. And then, okay, now I'm living into today. What did I learn? This whole thing we've been talking about in terms of love, learn, and let go. We've got to be okay with trying, experimenting, failing, and then trying again, and taking the learning, applying it, and have that be in spaces we're uncomfortable with, like the people stuff, right? Like talking about love in the workplace, like taking the time and prioritizing, because we talk about there's not enough time. There's not enough prioritization focus is really the issue. Where are you putting your attention? And the time is 24/7, and there's different demands and commitments on people's time, true. If it's important enough, won't you make the time or give it the proper prioritization or intention? And maybe it's an exercise on, we need more focus on how do I better prioritize these things on my plate, or what I believe in as a leader, so that I can manifest that. And so it gets back to the intention thing too. who I be, who I am as a leader. And that's a discovery process. And so where you are is fine right now. There's no judgment of where you are. But if you have this aspiration, what do you need to help you get there? What kind of support might you ask for and make a request for? And that might require some transparency or vulnerability. I'm not where I want to be, or vulnerability, or being just real with yourself. And I think the invitation would be, what if we were just more real with ourselves and not concerned about the expectations that might come from us being more real with ourselves?
It looks like Rachel wants to say something. Okay, because I was just going to add to this, and it was what you said, Rachel, earlier about time, and I love that Brian brought it back to the time. I was curious to think, or I was curious about whether the leaders who are not really being present and making the time for others, is there a correlation with them not making the time for themselves? And I'm thinking I'm answering the question for myself. So if we're going to start wanting to be there for other people, we've got to start putting the time to look at ourselves, because if we can't even do that, how is it that we're going to be fully present and loving and caring for the other people? So it has to start with that. And what is it going to take? And what's actually getting in the way of that? Because when I'm coaching leaders, that's the biggest thing right now, is this busyness culture and just, I don't have time, or I don't have time. I'm like, if you don't have time for people and culture, like how am I going to even come in here and help you? You're not even going to have time for our conversation just because I'm going to join and support you with your organization. Like, it's all of us that's going to really need to do the work to be there, starting with ourselves. So I was just curious. I don't know if I have a question or a comment, but I just thought I would just put that out there and see what comes out from that.
Yeah, I think what you're saying like points to something that, if we don't have the time for ourselves, then one, we're giving out of like fumes. Whatever we have for everybody else is like fumes, which is not really going to be a full way of giving to somebody, right? If we can't show up fully for ourselves because we're burned out, exhausted, overworked, whatever it is, that we have so little to give to anybody else, right? It's like the leftovers. We're giving them scraps, and they can feel it. Like, you can feel if someone just gave you a fillet with, the most, like, whatever, like a really rich plate of food versus like, oh, these are table scraps from 3 days ago. People can sense what that feels like and how differently that feels. And it almost feels like, Teresa, I'm glad that you mentioned what you did in response to what I was mentioning earlier, because what I feel like it pointed to is this idea of we have to be very careful to not try to manipulate somebody through how we show up for them. So it's like, well, I showed you this, or I gave you this, therefore it's like, okay, what are you going to give me? Okay, open up. And it's like, I think part of the disappointment comes from when we have that expectation that we have not communicated. And then it's almost like we're giving love with a contingency condition. And when we do that and we don't get the response we want, we're even more disappointed. It leads to disconnection. It leads to, a disrupted connection. And then we can often end up in this cycle that's not really healthy. So I think what you brought up is really important, because it's a reminder to be aware of, is our intention in demonstrating love, is it out of the right heart posture? Because if it's not, the consequence can be really negative. And same goes to your point, Lorie, if we're not really making time for ourselves, and then we think we're going to show up in a really abundant and gracious way with others, we're probably a little delusional. Like, it's not going to feel as authentic as if we were making time for ourselves first.
This for me comes down to the difference between, I choose to step into leadership because I am of the being who fills my own bucket when I lead other people, I give to other people, I coach and I elevate other people. That fills my bucket. I know this about myself. So anything in return is sort of icing on the cake. Compared to, I step into leadership because it's the only next place for me to step. It's the only way I can earn more money. It's the only way I can get the next sort of opportunity in my career. And so when we look structurally within business and we say is the only stream for people to progress, to step into leadership, then you are going to have people who should not be in leadership. If you provide other streams of opportunities for people to advance, whether they can earn more money in these streams or more opportunity or all of the things that they potentially could want, then you have people who step into leadership more by choice, knowing that I'm going because I'm going to have to give away all the recognition, assume all the responsibility, and I am excited about that opportunity. Not, oh, what do you mean I have to give away all the recognition and accept all the responsibility? I'm a little bit better at throwing people under the bus. It's just kind of, it's funny. It's funny when we talk about it like this, but that is the reality of what happens. And then when we kind of break it down and go, oh my God, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what's happening in my workplace. We're like, yeah, that's kind of why it's hard.
Yeah.
So
It's hard.
the dots you're helping me to connect, right? So we started with relationship to self, right? And if we're not doing it for ourselves, prioritizing self-care and prioritizing our time and prioritizing ourselves in our lives, that is going to influence our expectations of others and our relationships with others. So in the notion of modeling the behavior we'd like to see, right? Is your modeling, like back to your point, Rachel, where is the motivation or energy coming from? Is it expectation or invitation? If it's expectation, it's sort of getting to where, Teresa was sort of poking at, right? But modeling and just the notion of an invitation versus an expectation. I invite you to join us. No, you're going, you must join us is kind of the inference, if not directly stated. And so someone being able to prioritize how they engage with others, if they're not prioritizing time for themselves or not making it important, is going to be difficult because it's not on their radar screen. They're not tuned into that frequency of that need for themselves. So I find it rare that someone's able to do that with other people and not doing it themselves. I don't see that as being something that's common, if ever done. And so this whole notion of relationship to self is the starting point for awareness, learning, growth, and leading. It's self-leadership is part of loving by example, because you've got to understand needs from the perspective of when you understand your own needs, are you then more open and better able to understand others' needs, even if they're different, or being able to question into them and be curious about that? I know for me that's where my lens gets expanded, because I hear from you all and you help me see differently. I can ask better questions to determine those needs, but then I ask them of myself too, so I get a richer, deeper understanding of myself, and then I'm able to show up differently and be differently. And so I'm loving where you're all taking this conversation. So many nuggets there, but this notion of, we talk about modeling the behavior, but what's, like Rachel was pointing us to, what is the energy behind that? Is the expectation that you'll do this, or is there an invitation? Because I'm doing this as something that I'm doing for myself anyway, kind of like Teresa was saying, I'm choosing to be a leader. Not it's like the next step in my progression in my career and the next way for me to make money or whatever a personal motivation might be. It's a choice. So as we reflect on that, first I want to thank you all for an awesome conversation. There's likely going to need to be a 2.0 for this. There typically is, if you all are open to that.
Because we're still learning.
Because we're still learning. Yeah, we've got to come back and apply our learning and see what we've learned over the next however many time. Beautiful, Lorie. Thank you for that. So, so thank you, Rachel, Lorie, and Teresa for an awesome conversation. As we conclude the call together today, I'm going to invite you to share something you'd like to leave the audience with, or an encouragement or invitation, as we talked about invitations, for helping extend the learning and the conversation with the community that's going to listen to this and then comment and engage with our conversation after this. So what would that be for you? And then we'll do a wrap up after that. So I guess, Rachel, would you please start us?
I would say that it's a matter of removing the barriers to connection instead of trying so hard to make it happen. That, as you alluded to throughout this conversation, we are inherently connected beings. We exist because, you know, two people connected. I mean, that's how we come into the world. And so we're wired for that. And so part of it is, how can we remove the barriers to connection and to love? And when we do, I think connection will naturally happen and will naturally show up, that it's our natural way of being, to be connected.
Love that. Thank you, Rachel. Lorie.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Rachel. I love that. I love how you took a breath and then you kind of just like really listen to yourself as to what's coming up. And for me, I really love what Teresa said earlier about how we're just all on this journey of love and discovery. And so I would leave it that it is a lifelong journey, and to be kind and keep learning more about yourself, and know that we are all born with love. It's innately part of who we are. And it's just, I believe, our lifelong journey to uncover more and more about that, love, and share it with others.
Thank you, Lorie. Wonderful. Teresa.
Love is the first best 4-letter word. Every time I have given myself the permission to ride its wave, the most amazing things have happened. It has never brought me something I have regretted or hated or felt bad about, ever.
Mic drop. How do I follow the three of those closing points about this? It's like, wow, that's awesome. That's awesome. I guess I'll come back to some themes that we've had, right? So transparency, intention, being, committing to living into your aspiration around love, or whatever that might be for you in terms of your personal growth. Because it all starts with ourselves. Our relationship with ourselves creates our world. And as you know, words create worlds. So if you look at your language, energy is an indicator of how you're creating your world. So paying attention to that, and just remaining with that mindset of curiosity around, am I living into my aspiration and who I want to be? And and doing so without judgment, because failure is going to be part of that process. Just like it is with any successful process, right? And learning to be graceful during that journey and continuing that journey, applying what you've learned and creating better. And so we can do better conversations. This is where the energy is in leadership, in our lives personally. It all starts with self. And so self-leadership, self-care, self-compassion, self-respect, all these terms, right? All these things are things to maybe put some attention to, and invite yourself to consider what's working and maybe how might I do better, and celebrate your successes, right? The other thing is we have to have this big achievement. We talked about achievement, right? And acceptance. We've got to have the big, certificate at the end of just celebrate the small stuff, the wins on the way, because the journey, as you all are talking about, and we've talked about during this conversation, it's about the journey. The journey is filled with many successes. It's not linear, it's zigzag, curved, all these kind of different non-linear directions. And when we start to embrace the experience, we start to create the experience we want for our life. So I invite you into that. I invite all of those who are listening to enrich and extend the conversation around this topic of loving by example and leadership. And add your experiences, your stories. How have you gone about doing leading from this place? What are some of the things you've tried and experienced, and the struggles you've had, and then learn from And then what has that experience been like after you applied the learning, and how might someone benefit from your experience? So we love to extend the conversation and enrich it with your thoughts. So thank you all for listening. Thank you again, Rachel, Lorie, and Teresa, for this conversation. Grateful for you all for engaging in this with me, and let's do better together.